Hello and welcome back. This is the week 13 lecture. So today we start on Blake by Martin Delaney. This is our second to last text of the semester. It is our last novel of the semester. So it's rather long. It is broken up into two parts, so that's pretty convenient. I would like us to try to finish part one this week, and we will cover part two next week. This is a strange book in a lot of ways. It does take a lot of discussion. It takes a lot of analysis. There's going to be a lot of elements in Blake that might not be familiar for many of us, for many readers. That is the experience. It's written with some different goals in mind. Obviously, it is a bit different from what we've experienced previously because of the author and the sort of larger political and rhetorical goals of the book. So there are some obvious things we can point out, like this is the first novel we've read this semester by an African-American author, and it's only the second text in general, or only the second African-American author in general that we've looked at. Obviously, we read Phyllis Wheatley early in the semester when we were sort of taking our tour of the colonial period. We covered some of her poetry, but otherwise we have not experienced African-American authors. So this book is noteworthy for that reason, and it is one of the first novels written by an African American in our nation's history, so it's important for that reason. But also, what we're going to see here, because of Delaney's identity, because of his background, and because of what he's trying to accomplish in the book, we're going to see a perspective, and you might even think of it like as a worldview that's fundamentally different from what we've seen in other texts from other authors. And one of the easiest comparisons we can make here is to Benito Cereno, because as we saw in that text by Melville, here in Blake, there is a slave rebellion in the works. We spend a lot of time on the planning stages here, so obviously the insurrection is handled differently. In Benito Cereno, we essentially see the aftermath. We see what's happened after the slaves have taken control of the vessel, the San Dominic, the Spanish slaving vessel. And we see what happens afterwards. We see the process of discovery for Captain Delano and the ultimate violent conclusion. But here we spend most of our time on the early stages. We're talking about the planning, the organization of an uprising or an insurrection. And one unfortunate thing about Blake is that the book is actually unfinished. Delaney never actually finishes part two, so we don't get the satisfaction. This is kind of a spoiler, but it's okay. We never really get the satisfaction of seeing the insurrection play out. We don't really see it as a sort of clear, coherent action or series of actions. But that's another important thing that I want to talk about here today. And part of the reason is obviously just Delaney never finished it. But again, we have to talk about rhetorical purposes a little bit today. And again, I want to go back to Benito Cereno just to make a really basic comparison. So we talked about how the slave revolt kind of works in that text, right? And we discussed Melville as being sort of ambiguous. A lot of people did criticize and still criticize Cereno. I mean, it's a very skillfully done novella or short novel, whatever it is. But in terms of does it work as social criticism? Does it work as social commentary? Is it a clear denouncement of slavery? There's a lot of dispute about that, and a lot of critics say it's not clear because Melville is often very ambiguous in his depiction of, moral situations, and because we're getting a lot of information delivered to us through Delano, who is, as we talked about, a prejudiced, sort of biased observer. He doesn't narrate the story for us. We have a third-person narrator, but we get a lot of our impressions. We gather a lot of our information sort of through the eyes, through the perceptions and understandings of Delano. And because Delano misunderstands the nature of the slave rebellion, that means that we also, at least initially, might not fully understand, but we probably figure it out a little bit more quickly than Delano does. But if you think about what that all means on sort of a practical level, like how does the slave rebellion sort of function in the narrative, I think we can observe that it's providing a lot of suspense. It's providing action. it really is kind of a plot device in Benito Cereno. Not to say that that's all it is. I do think there's a larger statement or message about slavery being delivered and about sort of human depravity and what can happen as a result of slavery, how slavery can dehumanize everyone involved. So there are larger points, but just on a really basic level, the slave rebellion provides suspense, it provides drama, it helps to really propel the plot forward, right? We can really view it largely as a plot device or as part of the overall plot mechanics, okay? And that's all true. And then if the message itself is maybe a little bit unclear, as it often is with Melville, for some readers, that slave rebellion might only function as a source of suspense. In fact, it might be a little bit scary in the way that it's described and presented. Again, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago when we were discussing the story. There's a lot of mystery. There's a lot of gray areas. There's a lot of indeterminate stuff going on, at least initially, that readers have to piece together. But again, we need to understand that there's kind of this growing sense of dread, and we probably picked up on it as we were reading, this sense of dread as you know, as we as readers kind of understand right away something's wrong, something's not quite right on board this ship, but we don't know exactly what it is. And Delano also perceives that something seems a bit amiss, a bit strange, but he's not quite sure what it is. And it's really a process of discovery. But as you can imagine, for a lot of readers, the slave rebellion kind of gets boiled down to a scary thing that gets revealed in kind of a suspenseful, interesting way that fuels a lot of the plot and the events of the story, and that's kind of it. So even if we think Melville is providing a message, at least the slave rebellion is still playing an important role just in terms of the plot, just in terms of the overall mechanics of the story and the sort of aesthetic feel, the kind of aesthetic achievement that Melville is going for, right? So it's very literary, I guess might be a way to say it. The way the slave rebellion is handled, the way it's presented, the way it is rendered mysterious and sort of unknowable at first. All of that is really kind of a byproduct of Melville being a master fiction writer. And he's using something that was very real and something that had a historical lineage and contemporary relevance, and he's using it to construct an interesting, adventurous narrative that also maybe has something more to say. But most of those goals are connected to his role as a writer of literature. He is trying to create an aesthetically satisfying work of fiction. And I think he accomplishes that. It might not be a 100% clear piece of social commentary, but it is a pretty entertaining work of fiction. And that's what he's going for. That's what he's trying to create. Delaney, on the other hand, is using a slave insurrection in a very different way. So the subject matter is similar, but the way it's being deployed, the way it's being wielded and utilized by the authors is quite different. And it's not a disservice to Melville to say that he is, to an extent, using the slave rebellion for entertainment purposes. We can say that. That's a little bit of a simplification, but that is essentially true, right? He's using it to create an entertaining story, an entertaining work of fiction. And we might say, well, yeah, that's what every writer wants to do, right? But not necessarily. That's what writers of literature want to do. That's what novelists, short story writers, and poets typically want to do. And Delaney, Martin Delaney, the author of Blake, he writes literature, but that was not his primary job. That was not his primary vocation. He was more of a journalist. He was more of a newspaper man. So he wrote quite a bit, but most of what he wrote was nonfiction. So Blake was his only novel, to my knowledge. He mostly wrote essays, newspaper articles, and even what we might recognize as like academic articles of the kind that you would find in academic journals. He practiced medicine. He knew quite a bit about science. He was also kind of a political organizer, community organizer. He wore many hats. He was a pretty impressive guy, did a lot of different things throughout his life, and I give you a little bit of his bio in the Week 13 module, so I won't repeat that here, but make sure sure to read that. But again, he's not really a novelist by trade. He's not really a fiction writer by trade. So we need to keep that in mind. But more important is what he's really going for here. And again, I keep talking about sort of his larger goal or purpose, and it's largely rhetorical in its makeup. So if we talk about most literature, we're talking about aesthetics, and we can talk about something called mimesis, which you guys might know. You might know that word. It just means sort of mirroring reality, a realistic depiction of the real world. So a lot of times critics and scholars will identify what they call the mimetic function of a novel, and that's just sort of snobby academic speak for, how realistic is it? How well does the author capture life, the way people talk, the way things look, the way people act? Right? And I'm always fascinated by this because with certain genres, we expect a high degree of mimesis, right? With like crime fiction or, westerns or war movies, we want those to really be authentic. They get the details right. They're realistic, right? They capture the way people talk. They have the right uniforms, right? Or even with a lot of what we just kind of classify as drama. Almost like the modern day inheritors of the sentimental genre, sort of, family drama or relationship drama. Often stories centered around those are also expected to be mimetic in function. They're supposed to really, sort of accurately depict how things really happen. But with other genres, we don't demand the same level of mimesis. Maybe with science fiction, fantasy, we don't strive for the same level of realism, or we don't expect it. But in some ways we still do, right? That's what's so interesting. Even with science fiction, right? We might not necessarily expect the plot to be super realistic, but we often still expect characters to behave in realistic ways. We expect our characters to sound and act the way people really do. And even if we're on a different planet, in a different universe or whatever, we still expect a level of realism, at the very least when it comes to characterization or when it comes to dialogue. Certain things we do expect to be realistic. And this is often what novelists are striving for in their work, a high degree of mimesis. And then we can contrast that to a more rhetorical function. So you guys probably know rhetoric as a term that just refers to arguments, really. It just refers to the means of persuasion. So how do we make an argument? How do we try to convince people to do something or believe something? So, if you remember English 102, like you probably talked about rhetoric there. You maybe have encountered it at a higher level as well. But on a really basic level, when we're talking about rhetoric, we're just, we're talking about arguments. We're making arguments. That's what Delany is doing here. He's making an argument about slave rebellions. That's true, but there's more to it than that, because he's not just talking about specific slave rebellions. I mean, though he is using real ones and he's writing about one, but for him and for other black intellectuals of the 19th century, other writers, commentators like Delany, they would have viewed a slave rebellion in a very different way than Melville or any white writer, frankly. So we do have to talk a little bit about the race of the authors, because of course in the 19th century, as we can imagine, very different experiences, very different perspectives if we're talking about a white author versus a black author. So if we go back to Benito Cereno, again, the slave rebellion, it's kind of scary, it's kind of creepy, it creates suspense and tension and mystery. And a lot of white readers would have been scared by it, because to a lot of white Americans during this time period, slave rebellions were scary, because white people often assumed they would be in danger if there was an armed uprising of slaves. So it was of course, a very real fear in slave-owning states. But it was something that was talked about and written about really throughout the country. And I don't want us to think about the fear felt by audiences and I'm not saying that we should feel sorry for them or whatever, but I just want us to kind of understand how it would have been received by a lot of white readers. It would have been perceived as something very chaotic, something very destabilizing. And it is destabilizing on board the San Dominic because all the power dynamics and power structures that white people would have been accustomed to were being turned upside down. Again, we see direct evidence of that through Delano. That's why he doesn't understand. It's because he can't understand black people being in charge. But that's exactly what's happened. They've taken charge. So, like, that is upheaval. That is a disruption to the social fabric, right? Something like that. Something like what happens on board that ship in Benito Cereno. So from our modern perspective, I think we tend to say, well, yeah, and that's a good disruption. It needs to happen. There needs to be a disruption to the institution of slavery, which is obviously wrong. But we have to think about the perception of the time and how a lot of readers would have understood something like that at the time. A lot of white readers, even if maybe they were against slavery in kind of a general way, maybe they sort of supported abolition, it still would have been perhaps a little frightening to them, just on kind of a basic level, because it's new. It's different. And of course, white people were generally on top in these social dynamics. And if that position is threatened, or if you're suddenly going to lose power and be in a position of vulnerability, a position of weakness, that's scary. That's just kind of human nature. But it just so happened that white people were, accustomed to a certain amount of control and power and order based on the power they wielded. And slave insurrections threatened to get rid of all of that. Slave insurrections threatened to do away with the world order that kept white people, for the most part, sort of safe and secure. So that's a very different feeling, and Melville's using that, right? I mean, I don't think Melville wants us to primarily be frightened by the insurrection. I think he wants us to think more about it beyond just that, but he is using it, again, as this instrument of suspense. And on some level, it is a little bit frightening. It's at least frightening because it's mysterious. We often are afraid of things that we don't know or things that we don't understand. So he's using that. He's using that fear and anxiety that a lot of white readers would have felt about slave insurrections to help create this memorable narrative. But Delaney's doing something different, right? Delaney obviously also wants us to understand that slavery is wrong, that slavery has to end, but he's fulfilling a more rhetorical function. He's making an argument, not just in a general way like slavery's wrong. He's providing a little bit of a blueprint or a little bit of a plan that he thinks real African Americans can follow to achieve their own freedom. So there's a political goal here. There's a social and really a higher goal than we maybe sometimes associate with literature, which is, let's be honest, often just entertainment. It's art, it's pretty, it's fun, it's instructive, but there might be a little more going on here. It's a little bit more of a life or death thing for Delaney, for his characters, and for a lot of his readership. And that's another thing we have to understand, right? Melville largely writing, almost exclusively writing, for a white readership. Whereas Delaney is very explicitly addressing black readers. Now, of course, an African American readership would have been smaller because they were often denied access to literacy and education, but there was a small but certainly present, middle class black reading public that Delaney is kind of addressing. He's making this argument to them. And this is part of a larger sort of philosophical theory and set of beliefs that he wants to express. Slave rebellion is part of a larger framework, a larger sort of conceptual framework. And we need to see it that way. And we need to understand that Delaney's trying to make that visible through the novel, because it'll just help us to understand and maybe appreciate the novel. One thing, I don't mean to already defend the book before anybody's even read it, but I've taught it before, and just speaking from past experience, it can be a difficult read, and some students find it strange from a narrative standpoint, like in terms of the way the story is constructed, because again, I think we've been conditioned. Regardless of our own individual background, we've been conditioned by society to kind of expect more of what we saw in Benito Cereno, to see, we're expecting suspense, we're expecting rising action, we're expecting the slave insurrection to, in and of itself, be exciting, or a source of adventure, or some kind of, thing that's going to fuel the plot, right? That's what we expect. And when we don't necessarily get all of those things, as readers, we can grow maybe a little bit frustrated or a little bit confused. But what I often find has happened in the past is people will sort of take one of Delaney's like political or rhetorical goals and mistake it for a defect in style, if that makes sense to you guys. Like, there's no payoff, or nothing really happens. Like, it's not exciting. Like, we're not getting maybe the exciting scenes of death-defying action that we're expecting, right? Not that, Melville was necessarily the most action-packed, but we did get some action. We got a little bit more of a sort of direct playing out of the revolt. Right? We get some more definitive conclusions. Here, it's different, right? Because Delaney's not necessarily striving to entertain first and foremost. At least he's not necessarily striving to entertain the typical white reader of the time period, right? So the things that typical reader would have expected, and we might expect many of the same things, aren't necessarily getting delivered here. And also, it comes back to how Delaney is using the slave insurrection, right? For him, it's not really a source of entertainment in the same way it would be for Melville or another white writer. It's not really a source of suspense and death-defying adventure, right? That's how a lot of white people would read it. But for a black author and for a black readership, it wouldn't quite work on the same level. And in fact, it might even be considered a little offensive to use something as painful and as closely personal as a vehicle for entertainment, as a way to sort of titillate readers and keep them guessing, right? So we kind of have to think about that. We don't have to think Melville's necessarily doing anything wrong in Benito Cereno, but he's just being a white person, right? I mean, he almost doesn't have any choice as far as how he's going to perceive and present a slave insurrection. He can't perceive it and present it or depict it, from the inside. He has that outsider's perspective, which any white person would share, any white author would share. But Delaney gets us closer to not only the insurrection itself, or at least the planning stages of it, but he gets us closer to the realities of slavery and the realities of life in a slaveholding state during this time period. So this is where we come to like a big contradiction in the book. I just got done telling you that Delaney is more rhetorical than mimetic in this book, and that strikes many readers as weird. But we shouldn't overlook the fact that at times Delaney is very mimetic, and he does capture a high degree of realism. That's why we can't just dismiss it as a work of rhetoric that's not actually a very interesting read. That's another mistake that some of my past students have made. And they're like, yeah, I get the argument, but just in terms of, it being a novel, I'm not digging it. But there are really well-rendered individual scenes, and there are some individual moments that are going to be very vivid, very descriptive. And again, he provides a really interesting level of detail, and he sheds light on certain aspects of African American culture that frankly were largely unknown in the 1850s and 1860s when this book was published. And in fact, a lot of aspects of African American slave culture remain sort of largely unknown to a predominantly white audience even today. Because again, as white readers, white authors, they're just going to be limited in terms of their access to some of these really specific details. And they're going to be limited in their access to what experiences were like. That can really only be provided by, people who experienced it firsthand and can relate their own their own experiences. So this is important to think about in terms of Uncle Tom's Cabin, a really important book to sort of keep in mind as we start on Blake. So we can obviously compare Blake to Benito Cereno, but we can also compare it to Uncle Tom's Cabin, a very popular sentimental novel which came out in 1852. We talked about it a little bit back in week 10 when we were discussing popular literature of the mid-19th century, and I think I probably mentioned multiple times that Uncle Tom's Cabin eclipsed Charlotte Temple, an old sentimental novel from the 1790s, as the biggest best-selling work of fiction in America when it hit shelves in the early 1850s and really opened a lot of people's eyes to the terrors and horrors of slavery. So we talked about Stowe as a very successful sentimental author. Right, so Uncle Tom's Cabin is often held up as kind of a quintessential sentimental novel, not just because it was very successful, but because it kind of does all the things that we think of sentimental novels as doing. It prompts readers to feel very strong emotions. We are inclined to feel a lot of sympathy for the characters, especially the African American characters in that book. We are sort of, the idea is that readers will be sort of compelled to take on some reform-minded, roles. Like that's part of sentimental fiction oftentimes, right? Is to sort of not only make people feel, like Lydia Maria Child talked about this, right? If we feel good, strong, moral ways, right? If we feel sympathy for characters, if we can relate to characters, if we can, put ourselves in characters' shoes and think about what they're going through, that's going to make us better people. It's going to make us better Christians, better citizens, right? That's kind of the idea behind a lot of sentimental fiction. And that's very much what Stowe's doing, right? And it had real world impact, right? It's a great test study in how literature can do more than just entertain or just be art. Sometimes it really can take on a social function and a political function, and this book did. But we also have to acknowledge, and it's easy to acknowledge it now from our modern perspective, but there's lots of limitations with Uncle Tom's Cabin. There are a lot of things that modern readers and modern scholars and critics kind of wince at. And frankly, there's a reason it doesn't get read that much anymore. It's one of those books, kind of like The Last of the Mohicans, where like we talk about it, you need to sort of know the title, but we often don't ask students to actually read it. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but one of them is because certain parts of it have not aged all that well, especially Stowe's depiction of African American characters. So Stowe is a white woman from Massachusetts, who obviously was a very fervent abolitionist, believed very strongly in the evils of slavery, wanted to end it, and played a big role in, at least played her part in sort of making a larger public aware. But she kind of has, again, like I was saying before, kind of limited access. We don't even believe she really traveled much in the South. So she wasn't working from firsthand experience. She probably read a lot, did a lot of research, read some other accounts of slavery. So there's no doubt that she did her homework. And it's not that anything in her book is necessarily wrong. It's just that, again, if we're talking about realism and sort of authenticity, it's often thought that that novel lacks it, lacks a certain degree of authenticity. So clearly Stowe means well, and she wants us to feel sympathy for the African American characters, but she falls into a trap that many white readers fall into when treating issues of slavery or when writing black characters. And we're going to see other examples of this, and again, we maybe see it in Melville too, where the black characters are only viewed through a sort of white perspective. And again, I don't really mean this as a criticism of Melville or Stowe, because like I was saying, it's kind of unavoidable for any white author. But particularly in Uncle Tom's Cabin, critics have pointed out, and we saw this in Hope Leslie with Native Americans, and it's a recurring thing throughout the 19th century and even into the 20th, where, when sort of socially progressive writers wanted to advocate for the equality of Native Americans or African Americans or other minority groups, one of the sort of icky rhetorical strategies, at least as icky to us now, rhetorical strategies that they would often use is to make those non-white characters sacrifice on behalf of white characters, like sacrifice for white people. And we saw that in Hope Leslie, right? When Macawiska, loses her arm in an effort to save a white guy. Right? So that's part of how Sedgwick signals to us that this Native American character is noble and virtuous, because she's willing to do that for a white guy, and not even a white guy that she's in love with. As we know, they're just friends. She just really respects him. So that's even better, right? Because she's not driven by love, which can be sort of an illogical emotion, but rather she respects him as a person, and she thinks it's unjust what's happening to him. So she's willing to sacrifice, and that's a clue that is a clue to us that, oh, we can respect the character. She's on equal footing with the white characters. And that's very much what Stowe does in Uncle Tom's Cabin. The black characters are often sacrificing for the white characters and sort of working almost to redeem white characters. And again, we can kind of understand why Stowe maybe resorted to that. Again, probably not knowing many African Americans personally, or at least not very well, not having much access to African American culture, because again, most white people simply would not back then. Also, they probably weren't looking very hard, but it would have remained kind of mysterious to them, kind of not something that they were very familiar with. And again, part of that we're going to sort of see play out in Blake. But that's a defect in Uncle Tom's Cabin. It is, in this case, it is kind of a defect of style, but it's partly just her limitations as a white writer trying to write about black experience. Okay, so Delaney's able to sort of avoid a lot of those pratfalls, a lot of those problems. He himself was not born into slavery. His mother was free, I believe, but his father was a slave. And according to the laws of the time, if your mother was free, you were free. But they were able to sort of maintain a family unit, but I don't think his father and mother were always able to be together because of their different status. But Delaney, of course, knew many people who were enslaved. He knew many people who had managed to buy their freedom. His father was a slave. He was obviously pretty familiar with the institution. So that obviously helps him to bring a higher level of authenticity. But again, we have to notice also that the characters in this book, they don't exist to serve white characters. This might seem obvious to us, but again, in a sentimental novel of the 19th century, they would have been expected to be more like they were in Uncle Tom's Cabin, or more like the Native Americans were in Hope Leslie. The good ones help the white people, right? I mean, that's just a thing that you can track. That's a pattern. Again, that's how those characters are coded as good, because they're helping good white people. And they're kind of like good white people. So that signals to the audience that, hey, it's okay to like these characters. They're good Indians. They're good black people. Again, that makes us uncomfortable today, largely, when we see that writers are doing that, when we see that writers are kind of using one figure to kind of redeem the entire race by sort of making that figure, or kind of whitewashing that figure, we could say. It's very much what Stowe does a little bit. It's very much what Sedgwick does, and we don't have to blame them. Again, I think their larger intentions were good, but they were sort of prisoners of a limited perspective. And as we've talked about before, even a lot of white people who supported abolition in the 19th century wouldn't have necessarily believed in racial equality all the way across the board. They might still have felt that African Americans were inferior in certain ways, but still deserved freedom. There was a lot of nuance to people's views. So not everybody who necessarily opposed slavery also felt that blacks and whites were equal. So there were still a lot of problematic prejudice theories. We talked about some of the pseudoscience when we were discussing Melville, these different theories that a lot of people subscribe to that have been debunked. I mean, it wasn't sound science, but people didn't know as much back then. And of course, a lot of that was just used as justification for slavery. But Stowe's doing very much what Sedgwick is doing in Hope Leslie. She's trying to show readers that, hey, black people can be a lot like white people, so let's treat them better. So we can't question the effectiveness of that approach, but I think to modern people, it doesn't always feel great, and it doesn't always hold up all that well. And again, it doesn't always feel very realistic. It doesn't always feel authentic. So Delaney is a corrective to a lot of that. Delaney is doing a lot of the things that Stowe cannot do, that no white author really could have done, because he's closer to the realities on the ground. He's closer to the lived experience of these characters. So obviously that creates a different kind of book. That creates a different kind of reading experience. But also keep in mind that Delaney probably didn't anticipate a ton of white people reading this. So we do need to kind of think about the fact that he's more addressing an African American readership and trying to make an argument to them about what they need to do. He's not necessarily addressing white people or trying to make white people feel better about things or trying to make white people feel comfortable. So as a result, his book can be a little bit harder to approach for a lot of white readers. But once we kind of understand what he's doing, I think we can at least appreciate it, even if we don't always think it makes for great novel writing. Again, the book might remind us a little bit of Edgar Huntley. It might remind us a little bit of like modern chivalry, some of the older stuff that we read, where there's lots of good scenes, there's some humor, there's action, there's interesting stuff, but we might find the overall construction of the novel to be a little bit clunky, or to be a little bit difficult to get into at times, maybe not quite as accessible as some of the other texts that we've read. But again, part of that's kind of by design. Part of that's based on just sort of what Delany is going for here. And again, let's get back to that argument. Let's talk about it a little bit more. What's the sort of rhetorical message? And again, it has a lot to do with rebellion, insurrection, as a concept, not just as a literal thing that happens sometimes, because we've already talked about it, how there's a history of real slave uprisings in the U.S., and Delany's drawing on those, just like Melville was in Benito Cereno. But for him, for Delany and other black intellectuals of the time, like I said, a slave rebellion was a literal physical thing, a physical event, an occurrence, an action, but it was also kind of a state of mind. It was a way of thinking, and Delany writes a lot about this in his nonfiction. Again, he's kind of an essayist more than he is a fiction writer. So he writes about how, in order for enslaved people to become free, there's a process that they have to go through. There are several steps that they have to take. And like Frederick Douglass kind of writes about this. It's not just Delany. This is kind of common, it's commonly treated by a lot of black writers and thinkers of the time who are sort of theorizing about what it would take to become free, what it would look like. And a lot of them point out that enslaved people don't have a real strong sense of self. And that's not any fault of the individual slave. That's just what the institution of slavery does to people, right? You're taking orders all day. You're not in control of your own life. You're often separated from the people you have close ties to. You're isolated. You're not allowed to be educated. You're kept in ignorance. You're prevented from traveling. You're prevented from really doing much of anything for yourself. So as a result, you don't have much of a sense of self, right? You're so subordinate, you're so beaten down that you don't have a real clear sense of like what we might just kind of call like individuality. Like you have a personality, but it's not fully formed, right? It's stunted because of what slavery does to people, because you're so confined. So what Delany and others talk about is, it's a process. So rebellion, yeah, it can be an armed, like physical uprising, but it can also just be a part of this larger process as an enslaved person begins to develop what Delany often calls self-determination. It's kind of just like a new sense of self, a stronger sense of self, kind of like a new consciousness. And really what it boils down to is just becoming aware. And again, this might seem kind of obvious to us, but we have to remember how different it would be for an enslaved person, just kind of coming to the understanding that you were born free, that you are a free person just based on like nature, just based on the fact that you're a person, just like the masters are people. And you have the same rights as them. You're entitled to the same life as them. Again, that would have been a hard concept for a lot of slaves to kind of wrap their mind around, especially if you had lived your whole life in slavery. If you were born into slavery, if you had no knowledge of being free, if you never had the experience of being a free person, it would be hard to even conceive of yourself as possessing freedom, as being somebody deserving of freedom. So that's a big sort of thing for Delany when he's talking about this larger process, right? Step one is sort of developing some sense of self, developing that self-determination to say, I'm going to be in charge of my life. I'm not going to accept my enslaved position. Again, Douglass talks about this too. He says once he became educated, once he taught himself how to read and write, and he was able to read what other people were saying about slavery, like what, critics in Europe, of course, European countries had already abolished slavery. So what people were writing about, the injustices of American chattel slavery, And, he knew a lot of that sort of, intuitively just because he had lived as a slave. But he just gained a wider perspective, right? He realized that other people were saying that it was wrong. It wasn't just slaves who felt like it was wrong. Other white people thought it was wrong. Europeans thought it was wrong. Even a lot of Americans thought it was wrong. It was a debate, right? It wasn't like a settled fact the way it was often presented by slave owners. Like, oh, this is just the way it is. It's natural. It's great. Don't question it. He realized, no, a lot of people are questioning it. It's already ended in a lot of places. It can end here. Right, so becoming educated, kind of becoming enlightened. Douglas claims that he could no longer accept being a slave at that point. That's finally what really prompted him to escape to freedom, to leave Maryland, where he was a slave, and to go to New York, which was a free state. That's what finally prompted it, was just, being more educated and knowing more about the world. He could no longer accept his position. So that's kind of what Delaney's talking about. It's like, you got to get that consciousness first. You have to realize the depths of the injustice that has been inflicted upon you. You have to kind of understand your larger kind of role in the world. As strange as that might seem, you have to understand that you're a part of something bigger, and other people are kind of on your side. Like, people are advocating for you. There's movements to try to stop this. You can be a part, maybe, of the solution. So for Delaney, the notion of rebellion, and again, this is true of a lot of these thinkers, it's not just the physical thing. It is that. It is that. But in order to arrive at this personal freedom or this sense of self-determination, you have to rebel in ways both big and small, in ways both literal and figurative. Like, not all rebellions are literal rebellions. They might just be refusing to accept certain things that are forced upon you, or to not believe certain things that you're taught or sort of indoctrinated to believe, right? Rebelling in small ways. They might not manifest outwardly immediately. But the idea is that you're working towards something, right? These are all individual steps in a larger process that allows a person to ultimately achieve freedom. But there's this notion that before you can have literal, physical freedom, you kind of have to have a freedom of the mind. You have to realize that you were born free, that what's been done to you is not natural. It's not the natural order of things. It's a very specific social structure that has been built and maintained by people for profit, for political power, and, for other factors. And it's a process, right? It's largely just a process of educating yourself or learning from others the true nature of your situation and the fact that you have to decide to take action. And that's very important. That's very important for Henry, right? He's about taking action. He's about trying to deliver real change. And that's what Delaney wants too. In many ways, Henry is a mouthpiece for the author. So Delaney was involved in a lot of interesting projects sort of throughout his life. Like I said, he was a journalist, community organizer. He was a politician in the Reconstruction government of South Carolina. He was named to a position there in the years right after the war, when, of course, the South was occupied by federal troops. He endured a lot of harassment, threats, was essentially run out of town, which is what happened to a lot of African Americans who were appointed to government offices or even elected to local state governments, because that happened in the Reconstruction South. Suddenly, African Americans were allowed to pursue some things that had never been open to them during the antebellum era, and the reaction amongst many of the white residents of those states was often very violent, very oppressive. And that's kind of the history of the Jim Crow South. And then after the federal troops left, things largely kind of went back to the way they were before. Not officially slavery, but the Jim Crow era meant unequal. African Americans denied basic rights and basically had no political power. But we're getting way ahead of ourselves. But again, that's all stuff that we have to keep in mind. Like, this is very much a call to action. Henry in the book is trying to organize an insurrection, sure. So the insurrection is functioning on a literal level, but it also serves a larger purpose. Like I said, it's part of this larger process that's all about self-determination, personal freedom, and becoming aware not only of your situation, but what you need to do to fix it. So again, Delaney's looking for solutions. Delaney's looking for solutions to slavery. How can we finally end this evil institution. And one thing that he actually supported during his life was an immigration plan to Africa. So kind of one of these back to Africa ideas that were often in circulation throughout the 19th century. Some were more successful than others. Delaney helped to organize a journey, but kind of like with the intention of staying, or with the intention of settling some African Americans back in Africa. They went to what is now Nigeria. And I believe 1859 into 1860, Delaney and his group. And it's kind of interesting, a little bit of a footnote for us. We don't have time to get into it very much. But their scheme was largely halted by British colonialism. So, I mean, you can't get far away from colonization when we're thinking about the Americas, when we're thinking about Africa and the history of these places. So when they're in Nigeria, British colonialism in Africa is really just starting to get underway. So the Brits are there. And I think a lot of the land and the resources that Delaney's group was intending to use, the Brits were like, no, that's ours. We're taking stuff. This actually all belongs to us now. So Delaney, I think, quickly realized, and he wrote about this, like, oh, we're going to run into some of the same problems here that we're running into back in the U.S. The Brits are doing a lot of the same stuff that white Americans are doing. Not quite slavery, but taking a place, taking control of a place, and making the residents of that place second-class citizens, right? They start to see that. Delaney sees that. And he's like, yeah, maybe this isn't going to work out. But other efforts that he wasn't involved in actually did work a little better later. The country of Liberia, which isn't that far from Nigeria in the sort of western part of Africa, that was later founded as a resettlement colony of African Americans who had gone back. Liberia's still there. I mean, the descendants of those freed slaves from the U.S. are still there in that country. So it did work in certain instances, but a lot of those plans didn't quite pan out. Delaney's did not, so he returns to the U.S., but he also supported other sort of strategies. He kind of supported, in a general way, armed rebellions. He wasn't opposed to the idea of African Americans taking up arms and perhaps using violence if necessary to achieve their ends. So Delaney wasn't necessarily directly involved in a lot of these efforts, but he supported some of those efforts with money. And again, he was a community organizer, so he kind of used those talents as well to help coordinate, to help plan, but he often did not take a direct role. So for example, he was involved in the famous raid on Harper's Ferry led by John Brown. Another one of these events that helps to lead to the Civil War. Brown was a white guy from Kansas, but a very fervent abolitionist. And also probably a little bit of a religious fanatic, might have been a little bit deranged, but again, was on the right side of the debate. But Delaney knew him and helped to plan that raid, but did not actually take part in it. He was not physically present that night, but he helped in the organizing stages. He also supported this African-American writer and political organizer named Henry Highland Garnett, and Garnett wrote very specifically about the need for an armed uprising, the need for African Americans to perhaps resort to at least the threat of violence to get some of the things that they wanted. So again, like Delaney was not opposed to those ideas. He wasn't directly involved himself, but sort of on a theoretical level. Again, he's a journalist. He's writing columns and articles and academic writing, sort of theorizing about this stuff, thinking about this stuff, kind of gaming it out. What would happen? How could this work? How could this be put into practice? And he often did throw his support behind some of these schemes for armed rebellion. Another kind of important name, just another African-American writer of this time, a little bit earlier, but a guy named David Walker in 1829 wrote what was called The Appeal in 4 Articles, which is four separate but related essays about slavery and conditions in the U.S. And again, he's saying a lot of the things that we hear echoed in Blake. We have to take action. We have to do more than just sort of wait for things to get better, speaking on behalf of, African Americans, saying that we need to take direct action to change things. And that's very much sort of what Delaney is saying here through Henry. action. We need organization. We need to change the status quo. So it's a call to arms, it's a call to action. So the slave insurrection is serving a very different function. It's not there to spook white readers. It's there as kind of an inspirational thing. It's there to maybe sort of be instructional, like here's maybe how we can do it. It's not necessarily step-by-step instructions, but here's kind of an example of how this thing can work. But it's also this larger statement about the process enslaved people have to go through to become enlightened, to become independent, and to become capable of finally achieving that freedom. So today, I'm not going to get into the book itself all that much. Like I said, we can divide it up into part 1 and part 2. If you guys can try to read most of part 1 this week, that would be great. But I'll probably wait until next week to really discuss it, and we'll also cover part 2. I know we've had some long lectures lately, so I'll just keep this relatively brief, and I'll keep this week's lecture to mostly just being a sort of introduction to the book, sort of getting you guys ready. Because again, we're going to encounter a lot of new things, a lot of different things stylistically, rhetorically. So it's good to be prepared. So I'll do most of the content stuff next week in a slightly longer lecture. But just a few things to think about with part 1 as you're getting started on part 1. We can think about it as largely sort of being written in that sentimental style that we've talked about. So we've seen some examples of popular sentimental novels of the 19th century, right? And again, Uncle Tom's Cabin is a great example. So we're going to get a lot of the same elements in part 1. We're going to get some melodrama. We're going to get some heightened emotions. We're going to obviously feel sympathy for certain characters, especially African-American characters. We might be moved as readers. We might be compelled to take some kind of action, or we might be convinced that, social reform is needed. There's also going to be some improbable events and some kind of plot mechanics that, again, closely echo a lot of what we would have seen in sort of traditional sentimental fiction. Improbable reunions, people separated for a long time, somehow finding each other in these very sort of coincidental ways. These sudden turns of fate, twists of fate, all hallmarks of sentimental fiction. So, for much of part 1, it might kind of feel like we are reading a sentimental novel. In some ways we are, but again, part of what makes Blake so strange is that we have a huge shift between part 1 and part 2 in terms of style, in terms of how the book kind of reads. So if part 1 feels mostly like a sentimental novel, part 2 really doesn't. We can talk more about part 2 next week, but it's more of a historical piece of fiction. Again, it feels more political. It's a little bit didactic. That's a word that we might want to think about. Sort of, that's sometimes used as a bad word, just kind of like think of it as like instructive, right? Like it's supposed to be teaching us something, but sometimes it can maybe, there's the implication of like hitting us over the head with it. But yeah, part 2 feels different. The milieu changes, the setting changes. We're in Cuba. We're not even in the U.S. anymore by part 2. In part 2, we're meeting real historical figures, and Delaney's kind of weaving them into his fictional plot. We also realize that the slave insurrection that's continuing to get planned now in Cuba in part 2 is actually based on a real historical slave insurrection that was put down in Cuba decades earlier. So he's doing a lot of stuff with history, which he's kind of doing throughout, but he's doing it more explicitly in part 2. He abandons a lot of the sentimental tropes that we see in part 1. I don't know if he just gets bored with them, if he's like, yeah, I'm done with the sentimental stuff. I'm not really sure. Again, Delaney never actually finished the novel, so we're not exactly sure always how to take certain parts of it, but we can see the change from part 1 to part 2. We can see the shift, and we'll talk more about kind of how to classify part 2 next time. But if we're thinking about how to classify part 1, again, you're going to notice the sentimental features, but I would also encourage you to think about some other stuff that's sort of on display in part 1, and this is partly why we find Blake so interesting. It's a little bit like a lot of Melville's work, where it wasn't necessarily celebrated or read all that much in Delaney's lifetime, but it was rediscovered later. And one of the things that we've come to appreciate about it more in the 20th century is how, much like Moby Dick and other works by Melville, Blake really is like a collection of a lot of different things. Like, it's not just a sentimental novel at any point, even in part one. There's always other things that are kind of getting brought into it. And again, that didn't always appeal to readers in the 19th century, but nowadays we tend to sort of celebrate that, and that's often considered, like I was saying with Melville, that's often thought of as kind of postmodern, like incorporating a lot of genres, a lot of styles. That's kind of modern and a little bit ahead of its time. And just like Melville's doing that, Delaney's doing it too. So in part one, those sentimental traits are on display, but also we might see some ethnography. Go back to Cabeza de Vaca. Remember, we talked about ethnography, the study of other cultures. Delaney's providing a really granular, close look at African American culture, which, like I've been saying, was largely hidden and unknown to many white readers. So we see that now as a real virtue of the book, right? Is providing some really interesting insight into how slaves communicated with one another, how they sort of pass the time, like sort of, facts of their everyday life. But also we learn about some of the lore, the African-American folklore, the legends, the stories that, again, largely remained out of view, out of white people's view. A lot of that was based on history, the history of slavery, the history of wars, the history of past slave insurrections, which, again, wouldn't have been known as well by white readers. White readers were aware, as we've been saying, of slave insurrections in kind of that general way, but they might not have known a lot of the specifics. Now we're getting specifics. We're getting names. We're getting, certain aspects of African American folklore that Delaney obviously knew and was able to recreate. And we just don't find a lot of analogs. We don't find a lot of other examples of what he's doing from this same time period. So we can see a little bit of that African American culture on display. He's describing it, he's exhibiting it in a way that might even at times seem a little bit like social science. There's also the hero's quest. You guys are probably familiar with this. It's a very classic sort of narrative structure. It's been around forever. You can see it in the ancient epics where you have a hero going on a journey to, save his community or, acquire some essential thing. And he has to overcome various obstacles. He has to, defeat bad guys and rescue people. And ultimately, his success ensures some kind of cultural victory, right? It does something for the people. It does something for the larger society. And it's a story that gets passed down often through the generations. So we see that here. I mean, this is a hero's quest. Henry's our hero. Through much of part one, he is traveling. He is sort of hiding out because he can't be discovered. It's not, he's not allowed to travel freely. Slaves obviously had very little freedom of movement. But he is on a journey. And he's on a journey to accomplish clear goals. He's trying to organize this insurrection, but he spends a lot of time talking to people, learning about various regional cultures. So it's not just African American culture in general. We learn about how the slaves are, sort of practice different customs or have different traits in different parts of the South. Again, a level of detail here that we're not going to get from Stowe. We're learning about how things are a little bit different in Arkansas compared to South Carolina. We learn that the slaves in Kentucky aren't as interested in participating in an insurrection as slaves in other states. And there's reasons for all of that, right? Delaney explains all of that often through dialogue given to Henry. But all of that's explained to us. It's, these are the regional traits of Arkansas. These are how the slaves live in Arkansas, and it's different over in South Carolina. Different social conditions, different social structures. The injustice of slavery remains the same, but the nature of how slaves can communicate, how they can send messages to each other, how they can travel undetected, the nature of all of that changes. depending on where Henry is. So Henry's learning a lot about these different regions, the different regional characteristics, and how they affect the lives of the slaves and how they affect the viability of the slave insurrection. Because again, he's really looking for participants. He's looking for slaves who want to rebel, who want to rise up and fight for their freedom. And he's sort of making determinations about who's ready and who's not. And again, it sort of goes back to what Delaney was talking about, what I was telling you earlier about this process of self-determination, this process of arriving at a sort of personal independence. I am free. I was born free. I need to take steps to ensure that I once again am free. Not all the slaves are at the same stage of that process. Some, according to Blake, and we might think that Blake's a little judgmental, but according to him, some of them are ready to make that plunge, that make that leap and say, yeah, we're ready to fight, whereas others are not ready. And we don't necessarily have to see that as a personal failing. It's often explained as a byproduct of how slavery works. Slavery is not the exact same in all these different places. So certain structures of slavery will maybe determine how ready the slave population will be. And also where the slaves are descended from. Henry seems to place a lot of value on slaves who descend from like sort of old colonial stock from Virginia and Maryland. And a lot of them got taken out to the old Southwest that we've talked about, places like Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, Louisiana. So that old colonial stock is kind of valued. We might, again, think that's a little judgy, but again, that's what Henry is doing. He is looking for people who can help and participate in this planned insurrection. So again, we're going to see a little bit of ethnography. We're going to see some travel kind of tropes. Maybe we're going to see that hero's journey. But obviously, we're going to see a lot of sentimental fiction components in part 1. But then we'll have to have another discussion about this in part 2 as we wrestle with all the different sort of genres and styles that Delaney is using there. So I'll wrap it up here quickly. Let me just give you a sort of brief publication history. I think this is in the module, but I just want to repeat it so again we can kind of think about this book as it was then, and then we can also think about it sort of as it is now. So it was published serially between, I believe, 1859 and 1862. So it was actually still appearing, still being published during the early stages of the American Civil War, which we're kind of using as our endpoint, in this class, where we pretty much stop in our historical tour of American literature. So published serially in a couple of African American newspapers, or sort of like literary magazines. One was called the Anglo-African Magazine, and the other was the Weekly Anglo-African. So he published it, and like I said, Delaney himself wrote for newspapers and served as an editor for several abolitionist newspapers and many sort of African American newspapers who were largely staffed by African Americans, and again, sort of targeted to an African American readership. So that's where this book first appeared. So again, really sort of geared towards a black audience in a way that nothing else we've read really would have been. Not even Wheatley, really. Because that was, in the colonial period when I don't think there was quite as much of a black readership that was defined. Although, again, there were literate African Americans and free African Americans who could have read it. But there's probably a slightly larger contingent by the 1850s, 1860s. So, I kind of lost my train of thought. Oh, yeah, so that's when it's published. And just remember, that's only 6 years after. When the first installment comes out in 1859, that's only 6 years after Uncle Tom's Cabin appeared. And it's also just about, let me see here, it's about, also 6 years after the first novel ever written by an African American in the U.S. So we're not reading this book, but I wanted to mention it. It's called Clotel, the President's Daughter. And it was written by this guy, William Wells Brown, in 1853. And it's very much a sentimental novel. It's very much kind of a traditional sentimental novel with a focus on race relations and some of the evils of slavery. That was the first novel ever published by an African American in this country in 1853. So again, Blake's only coming along about 5 or 6 years later. So Delany is one of our first African American novelists. And he's also participating in this larger sentimental novel tradition that was largely dominated by white writers. But we see here, and we would also see in Clotel, that African American authors could use those same conventions to accomplish a lot of the same goals, and perhaps do it a little bit more authentically, at least when the subject matter was slavery and race relations. So keep that in mind. That's good context to have, to kind of think about where this book falls in sort of just a larger historical sense. But I also want you guys to think a little bit more about slave insurrections, real ones that actually happened in American history. So I think I mentioned some of these 2 weeks ago when we were talking about Benito Cereno, but I just wanted to run through them again just so you guys can maybe write some of these down. You might want to Google some of these. I think most of these have pretty good Wikipedia pages written about them. So you might just want to learn a little bit more because, again, this was sort of the backdrop to the slave insurrection that we see being organized here. Again, this was knowledge that a lot of Americans already had. And again, for white people, it would have been kind of scary to think about these real life insurrections. But for African Americans, they served a different function. They might have been inspirational. They might have been sort of guides for future action. They might have been warnings of what not to do, how not to get caught. But they were also part of this larger kind of philosophical kind of enlightenment journey that we've been talking about, right? It just is sort of proof that we can do this. It's possible. But of course, in the U.S., no slave insurrection had been successful. But that was not always the case. You guys probably know the history of Haiti. If we go outside the U.S., Haiti, which is a small island in the Caribbean, a former French colony, you guys probably know it became the first independent black republic in the Western Hemisphere. So that's the story of a successful slave rebellion. And the very early, well, I think it actually began in the very tail end of the 1790s into the early 1800s. But the slaves in Haiti rose up against their French colonial masters, rebelled, and won. They succeeded in their armed uprising. The French sent troops from the homeland, still lost the war. The former slaves emerged victorious, and they created a new government. So it became sort of the first like independent black nation in the Western, sort of world, in the Americas. Inspirational, a happy story for many of us now from our modern perspective, although it's a more complex story than what I'm giving you here. But again, for a lot of white American readers at the time, scary. If it can happen there, maybe it can happen here. So that was a successful rebellion. In the U.S., there was no history of successful ones, but there was a long history of attempted rebellion. And again, this is part of what kind of, we kind of get as part of the African American folklore. This is part of the lore, part of the legends, part of their culture that remained largely unknown or hidden from white people. So it can help us to understand a little bit more of what Henry encounters and learns about, like when he's in the Dismal Swamp with the high conjurers, and he's learning about colonial history, revolutionary history, former rebellion. So this is all kind of important stuff to at least be somewhat familiar with. So just a few kind of famous rebellions that often get talked about by historians and have been sort of turned into fiction in some cases. Gabriel Prosser, who I think gets mentioned in the book, he led a rebellion around the year 1800 in Richmond, Virginia. It was really put down before it could get underway, which was often what happened with these. If word got out, the authorities were alerted, and often arrests would be made, and the rebellion would be put down before any blood was actually shed. And as we saw with Benito Cereno and Babo, we know when the leader of a slave revolt was arrested, they were always executed without exception. So that happens to all of these guys. Later in the 1820s, Denmark Vesey is kind of an important figure in Charleston, South Carolina. He's a very interesting story because a lot of people don't think he was actually planning a rebellion. He was just sort of a local leader. He was a free man, born into slavery, but had bought his freedom. So he was a free black man in Charleston who was also kind of a local religious leader. And was kind of a community organizer, a lot like Delaney. And he had a certain amount of local sort of political power, at least with African Americans. And it's often believed that the white authorities just made up a story of an insurrection so they could kill Vesey because they feared him. They feared his popularity and the sway that he held over the local African Americans, both free and enslaved. So they just wanted to get him out of the way. That's one theory. I don't know if that's true. There's competing theories, but there's a lot of murkiness, and it's not 100% clear at all that there was actually a rebellion planned. Vesey was just kind of an important guy and a very charismatic leader. And then perhaps most famously, Nat Turner in 1831 Virginia. He led what is probably the most successful slave rebellion in terms of how close they came to achieving some of their ends. Eventually shut down. Turner was eventually apprehended and executed, but not before he and his followers killed nearly 60 people, white people, in southeastern Virginia, the area near Southampton, Virginia. So the bloodiest of the American slave revolts, at least that I'm familiar with. So a lot of bloodshed. It lasted, I think, for maybe a couple of days before before all of the participants were apprehended. But what's really interesting is Turner was then being held in prison, in that part of Virginia. And before they executed him, he was visited by a local journalist named Thomas Gray. And Gray sat down and basically interviewed Turner, and turned that interview into a novel that he released later in that same year called The Confessions of Nat Turner. Now, there's been a lot of debate about that book. Obviously, we're not going to read it, but Gray presented it as factual. He presented it as like the actual version of events that he got directly from Turner. A lot of historians and other critics doubt that. They think Gray was probably making a lot of it up. Some of it could very well have been true. It's kind of hard to tell. But there's been a lot of other versions of Turner's story that have been told since then. So it's been made into movies. Other novels have been written about it. Most famously in 1968, a well-known American novelist, William Stryon, wrote a book by the exact same title, The Confessions of Nat Turner. And his was a lot more skillfully done and more celebrated. Gray was this kind of a hack writer for some small-time newspaper. But Stryon's a pretty celebrated novelist, and actually his Confessions of Nat Turner won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction back in 1968. But not totally dissimilar to Uncle Tom's Cabin. We can sometimes cringe a little bit when we read Stryon's novel now. It's very skillfully done. Like I said, he's a very good novelist, but he's telling the story of Turner through this kind of white guy perspective. Stryon's a white Southern man from Virginia. I think his ancestral home is kind of near Southampton. So he has kind of a stake in it, I guess, to an extent. But again, we get into questions of authenticity, right? Like, can a white writer really capture the consciousness of an enslaved black man in the 1830s? It's a tough question to answer. But Stryon also invented some stuff, which is the novelist's prerogative, of course. But one of the things that he invented, we don't have any real evidence that is based on fact. But in the novel, Turner is in love with the white daughter of his master. And that sort of at least plays a role in his decision to seek vengeance. Based on what we know about the real Turner, that feels a little bit like a stretch. The real Turner thought he was like a prophet or a messiah. So again, a little bit like John Brown, maybe a little bit deranged perhaps, but a very charismatic person, kind of self-taught, very intelligent, had the power to kind of lead people, convince people to follow him. But again, kind of like a religious leader, And it's probably closer to the truth that his real motive was more sort of like kind of, this is fulfilling God's will or something. It probably wasn't like romance, like being in love with a white woman, but that makes for good drama. Again, it's kind of what happens when a white novelist, again, going back to Melville, this is kind of what they do with the material, right? It becomes drama. It becomes plot mechanics. It becomes suspense or tension or even maybe pathos, a reason to feel strong emotions. But in the hands of Delaney, it's gonna, again, it's gonna be different, right? Like his, like Henry doesn't exist to serve white characters. He's not in love with a white woman. He's not sacrificing for white people. He's not really talking to white people all that much. He does, but he's mostly focused on insurrection planning, which means African American followers. He's not here. Henry is not here for white people, and Delaney's not either. So again, we just get that kind of different perspective. But yeah, Turner, that's a story that continues to get told. A movie came out not too long ago, kind of based on those events. So again, you guys might just want to check that out. I'm sorry, I said Stryon's novel was 68. I think it was 67. Or, no, I have two different years. I don't know, 67 or 68. Maybe it came out in 67, won the Pulitzer in 68. But, yeah, so there's a lot of history. A lot's been written about slave insurrection. So it's good to know at least a little bit about it, but also to know that Delaney's using it in a different way. It's a conceptual category. It serves a rhetorical function. It's not really for entertainment. It's not to titillate us. He's making an argument. Right, and he's making an argument about how African Americans can arrive at self-determination and freedom. Okay, so that's enough for this week. We'll come back next week and actually talk about the novel in more specific terms. We'll do our best to cover both parts, and then we'll move on to week 15. That's our final week of instruction, so that's our final assigned reading. Just a couple of short stories. So once we finish Blake, we are almost at the finish line. And in week 15, I will cover the short stories from the Amber Gods. That's what we finish with. But I'll also talk about the final paper and the final exam. So next week, we'll just talk about Blake. And then my final lecture in week 15 will be divided between the Amber Gods and final work. And of course, your final exam and your final paper will be due during exam week. So if you have any questions about the schedule or any of our upcoming stuff, just let me know. And otherwise, I will see you next week.